Chapter 1. The Root of the Problem. My early years held no clue to the dramatic events that unfolded a decade or so later. A neat three-bedroomed house in the heart of suburbia was my first home. The house belonged to my mother's parents. I loved living there with my grandparents, Granny and Grampy, and my mum. Life was calm, ordered, and conventional. I was a happy child. Granny worked in an office, and my mum had a good job as a personal assistant at a prestigious law firm. It fell to Grampy, who had retired from the RAF, to take care of me. The other member of the household was Leo, my mum's ginger and white cat. Leo harboured a strange passion for being vacuumed. Grampy oversaw the vacuuming, and the cat insisted on being vacuumed before he started on the carpets, which always made the two of us collapse into fits of giggles. Grampy adored chess, and before I started infant school, he'd achieved his mission of teaching me how to play. He studied the game, read books about it, and played against a computer. He assured me that I'd never beat him, and when I finally did, at the age of 12, he vowed never to play another game against me. "There's no point in me playing you anymore because I've got nothing left to teach you," he said with a smile. My mum had split up from my dad before I was born. She was a slim, attractive woman with blonde hair. People sometimes told her she looked like Michelle Pfeiffer. My dad was tall, of medium build, with brown hair and a moustache, and had a tattoo of a heart, sword, and eagle on top of each other on his left forearm. He ran several pubs and had a reputation as a womanizer. His roving eye was the reason why him and my mum split up. I think she had thought she could tame him, but he just wasn't designed for lifelong fidelity. I thought my dad was wonderful. He lived nearby and I saw him regularly. One of my earliest memories is of him walking into the bathroom at Granny and Grampy's carrying a little pink bunny rabbit. I clung onto that bunny for years, until it only had one ear and half a nose left. I even went to my dad's funeral clutching the rabbit. My dad always had plenty of girlfriends, often at the same time, and when he looked after me, we often met up with one or other of them. I loved the fact that my dad didn't try to hide anything from me. It made me feel grown up. Sometimes he took me to see his mum, my nan, a woman I adored. She was small with curly black hair, and my special treat was to make toasted sandwiches in her sandwich maker whenever I visited her. She had a long back garden, and I used to love running around in it with my cousins Tom and Helen. My stepfather, Alan, was a different kettle of fish. I don't remember him ever not being around, although he didn't move in with us until I was 5. Alan was a tall, slim man with a receding hairline. His face was long and nondescript, and I couldn't understand what Mum saw in him. He was nowhere near as good-looking as my dad. When my mum decided to move out of my grandparents' house, she bought a maisonette, and Alan moved in soon afterwards. He then persuaded my mum to give up her job with a firm of solicitors. One day, he and my mum got married in secret. They didn't tell any family or any of their friends and just pulled 2 witnesses off the street. For the first few years, Alan and I got along well. I remember being proud when both he and Mum came on a school trip to the Forest of Dean with me. He often helped me with my homework and took me swimming. But by the time I was 10, and in my final year at primary school, Alan and I had started to argue about anything and everything. As these arguments increased, I felt more and more wretched. It seemed that, however hard I tried to be good, I couldn't do anything right. So, after a while, I gave up trying. While it seemed perfectly acceptable for the adults to shout at me, I was always expected not to show anger and to take whatever was thrown at me without complaint. Sometimes Alan was kind to me, gave me pocket money, and helped me with my homework. But at other times, he and my mum were excessively strict, sometimes grounding me for 6 months when I stayed out too late. For a 10-year-old, 6 months is forever, and their sanctions only made me more rebellious. I felt that neither Alan nor my mum were treating me fairly. This triggered a vicious downward spiral in which I didn't respect them and they didn't respect me. Whenever I went to friends' houses, I was conscious that they had much better and more relaxed relationships with their families than I did. Their parents were less strict than mine, and because they had greater freedom, they listened to their parents more, and there were fewer tensions. I wasn't unhappy at primary school, but perhaps because of my troubles at home, I never felt that I quite fitted in there. Despite the arguments, I was still basically a good girl. I loved drawing, played the clarinet, and was involved in lots of sports at school like netball. Being good at sport helped me to be accepted by the other kids, but I still felt like an outsider. I worked hard and passed an exam to get into the local grammar school. I was keen to go there, and my mum and Alan rewarded me with a bike when I found out I'd got a place. But once again, I didn't feel that I fitted in. Early on, a girl in my class was asked to read out an essay she had written. I gasped because the standard was so high, and I felt that I'd never be able to produce anything of that quality. I felt useless and inferior at the grammar school. If I'd gone to an ordinary comprehensive school, I would have probably felt more at ease and could have done well. I had friends at school, but was never as popular as I wanted to be. None of the boys fancied me. They all made for blonde-haired China dolls with names like Lorna and Lisa. I began to look for friendships elsewhere and started to spend time with a group of teenagers my mother and Alan thought were undesirable, who lived on some of the nearby council estates. I hung around with this group more and more, and for the first time in my life, I really felt that I fitted in. Like me, they were all outsiders, kids who didn't slot neatly into any group. One night, I'd been grounded. Even though I usually tried to stay out as late as possible to avoid spending time at home, I had had no intention of breaching my ban and going out. But when I went downstairs to get myself a drink, Alan assumed I was about to sprint out, so he leapt across the hallway, bolted the door, and grabbed the key. "Right, that's it," I said to myself, storming upstairs. "If that's what they think I'm going to do, I might as well do it." I was filled with hurt and rage. Impulsively, I grabbed the pair of compasses I used for maths and began to scrape out the sealant around the glass in my bedroom window. The pane I silently prized out of the frame was about 2 foot by 1. I placed it on my bedroom floor, feeling the wind on my face. I carefully lowered myself through it onto the corrugated plastic roof underneath my bedroom window and climbed over the fence of the house next door. My adrenaline was pumping. I'd never run so fast, and I was jubilant that I'd outwitted Alan and my mum. I continued running until I reached the phone box where I usually hung out with my friends. My heart was banging hard against my chest, and I couldn't catch my breath, but I felt euphoric. "I've just escaped from Fort Knox," I panted to my friends who were lounging against the phone box and couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. My friends seemed impressed by what I'd done. Although we rarely talked about what was going on at home, many of them were involved in similar conflicts. My mother and Alan had, of course, called the police as soon as they realised that I'd pulled off a great escape of sorts. I hadn't been in trouble with the police before, but because the phone box we chose to hang around, for reasons I couldn't fathom, was right outside the police station, we were all on first-name terms with the police. A couple of hours after I'd made my bid for freedom, 2 police officers walked out of the station and headed towards me. My heart started to jump around in my chest. I hadn't been expecting to get away with it, but now I wondered just how much trouble I was going to get into. "Come on, Natalie. Time to go home," said one. I was relieved to see that he was smiling. He was accompanied by a female officer who was also smiling. I nodded and allowed myself to be led to the police van. The officers weren't hostile because I wasn't causing any trouble. They probably thought I was just a good kid who got in with the wrong crowd. The phone box where I'd been picked up was just a few minutes' drive from home, and as I sat in the back of the police van, I braced myself for a huge telling off. I was approaching the age when I thought I knew much better than adults what was right and what was wrong, and I wasn't prepared to accept that my mum or Alan knew what was best for me. Alan appeared at the front door. What happened next stunned me. I'd run through various scenarios: being grounded for 6 months, having my window padlocked, being told off for days on end, and decided that they couldn't do anything worse to me than what they had done before. I could see Alan talking to the police officer. It was clear from his demeanour that he was angry. Then my mum appeared and timidly stood behind him. Although I strained my ears, I couldn't hear what was being said. The front door closed, and the policeman walked back to the van scratching his head. I couldn't understand what had happened. Why had they shut the door? I knew I wasn't being arrested because the police officer had told me he was taking me home. He climbed back into the van and looked at me kindly. "I'm really sorry, Natalie, but your mum and stepdad don't want you to come home now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I fought back the urge to burst into tears. There can be no greater rejection than to be thrown out of your home by the people who are supposed to be caring for you. "Don't worry, love. We'll take you back to the station and sort out a place for you to stay tonight. Your stepdad seemed pretty mad with you, but I'm sure he'll have calmed down by morning, and we'll take you back home then." While part of me was devastated by what had just happened, another part of me was relieved that I didn't have to go home and face the music. It was getting late and I felt completely exhausted. All I wanted to do was curl up in bed and forget the whole thing. I was taken to the lounge where the officers had their breaks and ended up playing pool with one of the officers, which took my mind off things for a while. Then I sat down in an armchair and waited. My eyes filled up with tears, but I was determined to be strong. I was still in shock that I'd been turned away. "Come on, Natalie. We've found a children's home that has space to take you for tonight. Off we go," said the police officer who had spoken to Alan. I hadn't considered that I'd be taken to a children's home, and had no idea what to expect. I felt scared, but at the same time I was too tired to worry about it. I followed the police officer out to one of the patrol cars. In the car, I kept blinking to try to stay awake. After a 20-minute drive, the officer turned off the main road down a private drive with overhanging trees on both sides. An enormous building loomed out of the darkness. A skinny man with curly, mousy hair greeted us. It was after midnight, and all the children seemed to be in bed. I was shown to my bedroom, a plain but not unpleasant room, with bland oatmeal carpet, and wearily undressed. The second my head touched the pillow, I fell into a deep sleep.